Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Inside Today's Boardrooms. I'm Eric Shore from Diligent Institute, and I am so excited to be joined today by Barbara Berlin, Managing Director at PwC's Governance Insights Center, to talk about the SEC's recently finalized cybersecurity risk management, strategy, governance, and incident disclosure rules. Barbara, thanks for joining us on the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you start us off by talking about some of the major changes to the final SEC cyber rules and the timeline for public companies to comply with these changes?
Sure, Eric, happy to do so. There certainly is a lot to unpack with the final rules, so I'll try to provide some of the highlights and some of the significant changes from the proposed rules. So the SEC voted to finalize the rules on July 26th, and the rules really aim to provide more consistent, more comparable, and decision-useful information to investors. And as I think about the rules, there's two main buckets that I focus on. One is the material incident disclosure, and the second is the risk management strategy and governance disclosures that you mentioned. And if we take the material incident disclosure rules first, what is important to highlight is that consistent with the proposed rules, companies will have to disclose a material cyber incident within 4 business days. And so that stayed from the proposed rules. And just to clarify, the trigger for the 4 days is when a company deems an incident to be material. So that's when the clock starts ticking, is when that when the determination for materiality happens. And so, when you think about materiality, the SEC is looking at what information is important to a reasonable investor. The other thing I want to highlight with regard to the final rules is that the SEC defined the material incidents. And when they did so, they said it's not only a single occurrence, but it is a series of related occurrences. So those related occurrences would be something like involving the same malicious actor or the same vulnerability at a company. So that's a change from the proposed rules where companies would have had to disclose when all immaterial incidents, when they considered them individually, would become material for disclosure. So that part of the rule came out and it was clarified, as I said, with regard to related occurrences. I also want to highlight that the final rules in this area did note or did allow a delay for when the U.S. Attorney General determines that disclosure would be important to delay due to it being a substantial risk either to public safety or national security. And for the material incident disclosure rules, the effective date for that is for companies to comply with the rule on and after December 18th, 2023. So that's about 4 months away. They did give smaller reporting companies a deferral, a 6-month deferral. And so for those organizations, they would have to comply on or after June 15, 2024. Now, with regard to the second bucket of the rules around disclosures for strategy, risk management, and governance, as we look at the risk management and strategy disclosures, the SEC did streamline those and made them a bit more principles-based. And even though they did that, I think it's important for organizations to recognize that they will need collaboration and careful consideration across the organization to make sure that they have the appropriate disclosures that are with the intent of the rule. Now, for companies, they would have to disclose the company's process around risk assessment and risk management for material cyber risk. And there's a few other requirements around that with regard to descriptions of third-party programs, how the cyber program integrates with the overall ERM program, and a few other areas. And that brings me kind of to the final one. There's a lot, as I said, with the rules. When we think about the governance disclosures, one big change that I know boards will be very interested in is that boards will not have to disclose whether they have cyber expertise and the names of those directors who have such expertise. So that was taken out of the rules, and that was probably one of the top questions that we've been getting since the rules were proposed. But they did still keep in some of the governance disclosures that boards would have to disclose who owns oversight and how they stay informed about this area. And the SEC did focus on management expertise. and ask or would require companies to disclose who at the management level is responsible for risk assessment, risk management, and to describe that management's expertise. So, as I said, there's a lot to the rules, but maybe those are some of the significant highlights that I think are important to highlight here.
What a great overview. Now, thank you, Barbara. And I want to come back to this concept of the material incident rule. I know some board members and management teams sighed a bit of a breath of relief when they heard about the delay that they can get if they're working with the Attorney General. But 4 days is not a lot of time, and there's no guarantee that you'll be able to get a delay from the Attorney General. What should companies be thinking about today, realizing that pretty soon this rule will be in place that will require them to disclose material incidents in 4 days so that in the event something happens, they'll be ready?
Yeah, Eric, good question. And you're right. That delay by the Attorney General is when there is substantial risk to national security and public safety. So I don't see that delay, being used extensively, across all companies. So I think what this does is I think about material incident disclosure is that, it really highlights the importance of companies to make certain that they have a robust internal escalation process, as well as a robust external reporting process for cybersecurity with these changes. And so, as I talk to boards, as I talk to management teams, I think, the board will want to understand what is the guidance and the framework that the company is using for internal escalation of occurrences at a company. And that is from, detection and monitoring to management within the company, to senior management, and ultimately to the board. And I think it's important for the board to understand who is this information being reported to. Is it the board chair? Is it the audit committee chair? Is it another committee chair? And I think part of that aligns with what board or what committee of the board is actually overseeing cybersecurity. And I would still say the majority of companies do have cybersecurity oversight sitting with the audit committee. I also think it's important for the board to understand and weigh in on the factors that are being considered for materiality at the organization, both the quantitative and qualitative. This will be a difficult process for companies. And so for boards, they'll want to understand what are those factors, who's weighing in on determining materiality, were external advisors or will external advisors be used to help with that decision? So that's another area that I think, boards will want to talk to their management teams about. I think also making certain that cyber is plugged into the company's disclosure controls and procedures committee as we think about this 4-day disclosure. As you said, it's a tight deadline for companies. I think it will be a challenge for companies. So the more they get their processes in place to meet this timeline and this requirement is important at this stage. And probably the last thing I would say as I think about the material incident disclosure is for companies to just think about how prepared they are for when a material incident hits at an organization. I know this is an area a lot of boards are focused on, but making certain the company has, a documented crisis management plan. Tabletop exercises can be really valuable to help the management teams. They're led by the management teams to prepare for when these incidents happen, to make certain that roles and responsibilities are clear, and that they've reduced the decision-making process and created as much efficiency as they can in the process before an actual incident happens. So those are just some of the things that I think about and, that are coming up in my discussions.
And you mentioned the second bucket, the risk management and governance disclosure requirements. Based on all the conversations that you have with boards, how prepared are companies to comply with these requirements? What advice are you giving in your conversations today to make sure that clients that you're working for are ready to make these disclosures?
As we look at these disclosures, as you said, we spend a lot of time talking to boards, talking to the management teams that report to boards. We also spend a lot of time reading proxies, sustainability reports, 10K reports of companies. And I would say right now, not many companies have disclosed these risk management strategy disclosures that the SEC is requiring. Most companies aren't describing their risk assessment process, their risk management process, their third-party program. So I think we'll see, definitely some greater transparency here in how companies are handling this important risk. As I have my conversations, I'm talking to boards about talking to management, the CISO, about where the gaps are today. So if they look at their current disclosures and what the required disclosures are, how would those disclosures change? And I think it's important to do that now, or do it, fairly soon, and not wait to the end of the year, because as companies start to think about that disclosure, when they put pen to paper and start writing it, they might actually find holes. They might find they want to add some processes or some policies at the organization. And they're going to want to do that sooner rather than later. If you do this at year end, or, after year end, before your filings are due, you'd miss the chance to make any changes. And so I think, this is something that, as I said, we're sort of mentioning and talking to the boards and management teams that we're talking to. And then I think the other thing that I would mention is that, I think this is a great time for boards to take a look at their reporting that they're getting from management in this area. As we've talked about material incident disclosure, we've talked about some of these requirements around risk management and strategy. Boards should be making certain that they're getting the information they need to be able to discharge their responsibilities. So are they getting it? Are they getting it in a format that's helpful to them? Oftentimes I hear a lot about boards saying that the information is different every time they meet with the CISO, that it's not consistent. So a lot of boards have adopted a dashboard to help with that process and making certain that the company is making progress in this area. And then to look and see if, the board is getting information in all these different areas, and it's giving it the insights that the board needs to weigh in on management's risk and how they're addressing the risk in this area. And then probably the last point that I would raise is, we talked about the cyber expertise not being required to be disclosed now, but it's still important for boards to think about how they continue to be upskilled in this area. Cybersecurity is a technical area. It continues to evolve as companies' digital footprint increases, as they adopt new technologies, as they develop new products. And then we also have the threat actors who are getting more sophisticated, whose attacks are getting more sophisticated. And so I think it's important for boards to continue to think about how they get upskilled, whether that's presentations from the CISO, the CIO, whether it's asking third parties to come in and help them in a particular area, or whether it's attending conferences to get the latest updates. But the board should be paying attention to how it increases its cyber acumen. So those are a few things, Eric.
Well, Barbara, thank you so much. There is a lot to digest coming out of the new SEC rules. And on behalf of all of our viewers, thank you for walking us through the highlights. I'm sure this is a topic that we will be discussing again and again as companies begin to comply. We're out of time for today. Thank you again to Barbara Berlin, Managing Director at PwC's Governance Insight Center. We'll see you all again next week.